What if everything you were taught about history was wrong? Ava Carter stood in front of the old, oak bookshelf in her small, cluttered apartment. The air was thick with dust as she ran her fingers over the spine of countless books, each one neatly labeled with the names of famous figures, historical events, and philosophies that had shaped the world. But today, nothing caught her eye. Nothing felt right. For years, she had immersed herself in these texts, but something was missing, an uncomfortable void that lingered at the back of her mind. As a history professor, Ava's life revolved around facts, evidence, and academic rigor. She prided herself on her ability to sift through the past with precision. Yet, lately, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something overlooked in the narrative she had spent her career studying. What if, she thought, the history she'd spent her life teaching was incomplete? Ava's pulse quickened as she picked up a small, unassuming book from the shelf. It wasn't one of the thick academic volumes she was used to, it wasn't even one she remembered ever seeing before. The cover was simple, dark, weathered leather with gold lettering that read, "The Hidden Black Figures in the Bible." Her heart skipped a beat. She had never seen a book like this in her professional circles. History, especially biblical history, had always been whitewashed in the mainstream academic world. But black people in the Bible? She had never heard much about them, at least not beyond the surface-level references she'd been taught in her youth. Curiosity gnawed at her. She flipped open the book, feeling the texture of the pages beneath her fingertips. It felt like a treasure chest of forgotten knowledge. Her eyes scanned the first page. There is a rich and complex history of black people in the Bible, a history that has been hidden from most of the world. It is time to uncover the truths that have long been buried. Ava was hooked. She had to know more. But as she sat down to read, doubts crept in. Was this just another one of those fringe books, filled with sensationalized claims and baseless ideas? She had always been skeptical of anything that strayed too far from academic consensus. But something about this felt different. The tone wasn't the typical rhetoric she had come across in other books, this one felt sincere. As she flipped through the pages, the author's claims were startling. The Queen of Sheba was black. Moses' wife, Zipporah, was from Ethiopia. And one of Jesus' own disciples, Simon of Cyrene, was from North Africa. Could it be true? Ava paused, the weight of the idea sinking in. She had always been taught that the Bible, like many historical texts, was a reflection of its time, a time when race and ethnicity were understood differently. And yet, she could never ignore the lingering feeling that the stories we were told had been shaped by selective storytelling. How many significant figures had been erased or altered over the centuries to fit a narrow narrative? She closed the book, feeling a mixture of excitement and unease. For a moment, Ava couldn't help but wonder, why hadn't anyone ever told her this before? The implications of this new knowledge seemed enormous, and yet it was being left out of the textbooks, the sermons, the teachings. Had it been deliberately hidden? And if so, why? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She glanced at the clock, it was nearly 6 p.m. "Coming," she called out, setting the book aside for a moment. It was her brother, Isaac. He was standing in the doorway, looking concerned. "Ava, you okay? You've been distant lately. You haven't even called Mom and Dad in a few days." Ava smiled, trying to push away the weight of her new discovery. Isaac was always worried about her, ever since they were kids. He was the more grounded one in the family, while Ava had always been the dreamer. But now, as she looked at him, she realized something she hadn't admitted to herself. She was starting to feel like something had been missing from her life for a long time. Something deep. "Yeah, I'm fine," she lied, brushing her hair back. "Just, got caught up in something." Isaac raised an eyebrow. "Something? You mean your job, or something else?" Ava hesitated. She could tell her brother wouldn't let it go until she opened up. But could she really explain to him what was happening? How her entire understanding of history, her identity, and even her purpose seemed to be shifting under her feet. I'm just reading a book, she finally said. About Black history in the Bible. It's kind of shaking things up a bit. Isaac frowned. Wait, you mean like, people in the Bible were black? I thought that was just some kind of. No, Ava interrupted, her voice sharper than she intended. It's not what you think. This book talks about real figures, real history, that's been buried for centuries. And I think it's time we started to acknowledge it. Isaac took a step back, his brow furrowing. Are you serious? That's a lot to take in. I know, Ava said, feeling the weight of the words. It's not what I expected, either. But everything I've been taught, everything I've been telling my students, it doesn't feel complete anymore. And I can't just ignore that. Her brother seemed to think for a moment before sighing. I get it, Ava. But you know how people are. History has been written one way for so long, it's going to be tough to change their minds. Ava nodded. I know. But I have to try. Maybe there's more to our story than we've been told. Her brother's expression softened. Just don't get too carried away, okay? I don't want to see you get hurt over something like this. I'll be careful, Ava promised, though she knew deep down that she couldn't back down now. She had to uncover the truth. As Isaac left, Ava sat back down, her mind racing. This was bigger than just a book. This was a journey into a history that had been deliberately obscured, and she was only just scratching the surface. What other truths were out there, waiting to be revealed? She opened the book again, the pages beckoning her forward into a world of hidden history, one she was determined to uncover. But deep down, she knew this journey would come with a price. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Ava Carter had always felt like an outsider, even in her own family. Growing up in the quiet suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia, she was the bookish child, the one who stayed up late reading history textbooks instead of playing with the neighborhood kids. Her parents, both educators, had instilled in her a deep respect for knowledge, but their focus had always been on conventional history, on the great empires, the world wars, and the political leaders who shaped nations. The narratives they taught were familiar, but they left something important out. Something Ava hadn't been able to name until now. Her family was black, a lineage of generations rooted in the struggles and triumphs of African Americans. But the history she learned in school didn't reflect that. In her textbooks, there were few mentions of people who looked like her, let alone black figures with true power or influence. She'd spent years poring over ancient civilizations and European monarchies, but the history of black people, especially in the context of religion, felt distant, erased, and underrepresented. Her father, James Carter, had been a well-respected professor at a local university, known for his deep knowledge of American history. He had shaped Ava's early understanding of the world, instilling in her a sense of pride in her heritage, but also a sense of limitation. You can be anything, Ava, he'd always told her. But remember, history is written by the victors. We're often left out of the story. Her mother, Dr. Lena Carter, was a scholar of African American literature, and though she often spoke of the importance of understanding history from multiple perspectives, her academic work mainly centered on the Harlem Renaissance and the Civil Rights Movement. Like most of her peers, she had focused on the struggles of Black Americans in the 20th century, finding beauty and resilience in the adversity. Yet, there was a part of Ava's soul that always felt restless, yearning for something more, something deeper. She'd always wanted to know how the African roots of her ancestors intertwined with the broader story of human civilization, how they fit into the world before they were stripped of their history through slavery. But her family, while supportive, was largely traditional. They followed well-trodden paths in academia, and Ava often felt like her interest in uncharted waters, particularly the ancient African history connected to the Bible, was foreign to them. They didn't understand why she couldn't simply accept the narratives handed down by textbooks. As Ava had grown older and entered the world of academia, she realized that her sense of unease wasn't an isolated feeling, it was shared by many of her peers in history departments. There was an unspoken tension, a collective silence, when it came to the subject of Black history in ancient texts. It was as if certain truths were too uncomfortable to examine, too disruptive to the conventional narratives. In her first year of university, Ava had chosen to study history, excited to uncover the untold stories. But as she delved deeper into her coursework, the same pattern emerged again and again. Stories of kings and queens from Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East were always centered in her studies. African history, while acknowledged, was always treated as peripheral, something that existed elsewhere and didn't truly shape the world as we knew it. The Bible, of course, was a central focus in her religious studies class, but its interpretation seemed far removed from the lived experiences of Black people. It was in her second year of university that she first began to notice the subtle absence of Black figures in biblical narratives. She was studying the Old Testament when she realized that there were few mentions of any people of African descent, even though the Bible had been written in the ancient Near East, a region that connected Egypt, Ethiopia, and Israel. There were occasional mentions of Africa, but they always seemed to be distant or secondary. Ava began to wonder why, if the history of the Bible was so integral to Western civilization, its African roots were rarely acknowledged. And so, as she entered her graduate studies, Ava's interest began to shift. She became obsessed with uncovering these hidden figures. She began to research the presence of Black people in the Bible, diving into ancient texts, archaeological findings, and historical records that challenged the conventional understanding of biblical history. It was there, buried under centuries of bias, that she found the first hint of what would eventually shake her worldview, the Queen of Sheba. It was no surprise that Ava's professors didn't share her growing curiosity. They encouraged her to stick with mainstream historical analysis. Her peers had already cemented their academic careers in traditional areas, and any attempt to challenge those established narratives was met with eye rolls or whispered skepticism. Despite this, Ava was determined. The more she researched, the more she found. More evidence of powerful Black figures in the Bible, figures whose legacies had been obscured by time and tradition. But when she brought her findings to light, she was met with resistance, particularly from older scholars who dismissed her work as fringe. When Ava began working on her thesis, tentatively titled, The African Presence in Biblical History, she spent countless nights buried in books and online databases, her eyes strained from staring at centuries-old manuscripts and interpretations. She discovered that the Queen of Sheba, often depicted as a mysterious foreign queen in the Bible, was in fact from the kingdom of Saba, believed to be in modern-day Ethiopia or Yemen. The kingdom's connection to ancient African civilizations was unmistakable, but this history was largely ignored in her academic circles. She then uncovered a fascinating and equally ignored fact: Moses' wife, Zipporah, was from Ethiopia. In the book of Exodus, she was mentioned briefly but with little fanfare, despite her obvious importance in the life of Moses. Ava couldn't believe how these figures, central to the biblical narrative, were almost always presented as background characters, without recognition of their African heritage. It was after uncovering these truths that she felt a sense of urgency. She needed to know more. These figures were significant, not just for their roles in biblical stories, but because they were part of a forgotten history that shaped the foundations of Christianity and Judaism. But Ava knew that the academic world was a tough place to challenge deeply entrenched beliefs. She had seen it happen before. Scholars who dared question the accepted narratives were often marginalized or dismissed as radicals. Yet, her discovery felt too important to let go. She wasn't just uncovering history, she was reclaiming a part of her identity that had been systematically erased. The Bible wasn't just a religious text, it was a reflection of the power dynamics and histories that shaped the ancient world, including Africa. Ava had spent her life learning about history from a Eurocentric perspective, and now, as she looked deeper into these hidden truths, she saw a different world, a world where Black people weren't just passive recipients of history, but active participants. Ava's connection to her past, her heritage, and her identity was growing stronger with each discovery. But little did she know, her journey into uncovering the hidden black figures in the Bible was only just beginning. Ava's obsession with her research grew by the day. The more she uncovered about black figures in the Bible, the more the world around her seemed to push back. It wasn't just academic resistance. It felt like society itself was rejecting her findings. She was being pulled into a conflict that she hadn't anticipated, a battle of truth, tradition, and identity. Her days were spent in the university library, combing through texts, scanning ancient manuscripts, and even reaching out to obscure experts in biblical history who might offer support. But nights were the hardest. Each time she looked into the depth of history, her own past came flooding back to her. Ava felt the weight of her family's expectations pressing down on her. They'd always been proud of her achievements, but their pride was grounded in what was considered safe and conventional. Her father, though loving, was a firm believer in the established narrative of history. He couldn't fathom why Ava was digging so deep into an area so few had explored. One evening, she sat at the kitchen table in her parents' house, surrounded by a stack of books and notes. Her father walked in, noticing the heavy concentration on her face. "Ava, you've been at this for hours," he said, trying to break the silence. "You need to take a break. What's got you so hooked?" Ava glanced up, knowing her father meant well, but she could see the skepticism in his eyes. He had always been proud of her intellect, but this was different. He didn't understand why she was so consumed by a narrative that, in his eyes, seemed like little more than speculation. "I'm working on my thesis," she said quietly, her voice edged with frustration. "It's about the African presence in the Bible. You wouldn't believe what I've found." Her father raised an eyebrow, setting down his cup of tea. "The African presence in the Bible?" He shook his head with a smile, but there was an undertone of concern. "Ava, I get that you want to dive deeper, but these are ancient texts. People have been interpreting them for centuries. What are you really going to uncover that hasn't already been said?" Ava felt her pulse quicken, a mixture of determination and defensiveness rising within her. "There's so much that's been ignored, Dad. We've been taught for years that the Bible is this Western, Eurocentric document, but the truth is, it's deeply connected to African history. The Queen of Sheba, Moses' wife, Zipporah. They were African. They were pivotal figures, and yet they've been brushed aside." Her father's face tightened, his brow furrowing. "Ava, you know how much respect I have for your work, but I don't think this is the right direction. You're going to get lost in this. There are bigger issues in our community that you should be focused on. You can't change history just by reinterpreting old texts." Ava felt a pang of hurt. She had always admired her father's wisdom, but now his words felt like a barrier between them. It wasn't that he didn't want her to succeed, it was that he didn't understand the importance of this mission. He wasn't ready to accept that history could be rewritten, especially when it came to something as sacred as the Bible. He was a product of his time, and so was she, yet Ava couldn't ignore the feeling that there were things that needed to be unearthed, for her own identity and for the generations who had been erased from history. "I'm not trying to change history, Dad. I'm trying to uncover it," she said, her voice growing steadier with each word. "We can't keep pretending that these figures didn't exist. They were there, and their contributions matter." Her father fell silent for a moment, his gaze softened, but his skepticism was evident. "I just want you to be careful, Ava. The world isn't ready for the things you're uncovering." Ava nodded, though the weight of his words lingered in her mind. She knew her father was right about one thing: the world wasn't ready. The more she shared her discoveries with her peers, the more she found herself isolated. She couldn't shake the feeling that the more she delved into the African roots of biblical history, the more resistance she encountered. It wasn't just her family and colleagues, even the broader public seemed dismissive. Ava began to notice more and more articles, social media posts, and academic blogs that downplayed or outright dismissed the idea of an African presence in biblical history. Some went as far as calling her work divisive, accusing her of playing into conspiracies. Others claimed she was misinterpreting historical facts, or worse, fabricating them for attention. As much as Ava tried to ignore the noise, it stung. One particular evening, Ava found herself in a heated email exchange with a colleague, Dr. Jennifer Foster, a respected scholar in ancient texts. Jennifer had written a blog post criticizing the resurgence of theories about black biblical figures, dismissing them as unsubstantiated. Ava had pored over the post, feeling an uncomfortable mixture of anger and disbelief. Jennifer had been one of the few scholars she respected, and now she was questioning Ava's entire body of work. "Dear Dr. Carter," the email began, "while I respect your academic journey, I must strongly disagree with your assertions about black figures in the Bible. The historical evidence simply does not support such claims, and I believe your research is dangerously misleading. I urge you to reconsider your position before you go down a path that could harm your credibility." Ava's fingers trembled as she read the words. Her heart sank. She had expected criticism, but this was personal. Dr. Foster had called her research dangerous. It was a harsh word, one that she couldn't shake. But Ava refused to back down. Her belief in the truth of her discoveries was unwavering, and if anything, this response only solidified her resolve. She fired back with a carefully crafted response, defending her research and providing evidence she had uncovered. She linked to archaeological discoveries, ancient texts, and historical documents that supported her claims. She explained how the Bible, as one of the world's most influential religious texts, had been shaped by diverse cultures and peoples, including those from Africa. But Ava knew that these exchanges weren't just academic debates, they were deeply personal battles. With every piece of evidence she presented, she felt more alone. She was challenging the very foundation of the academic world, one that had long been dominated by white scholars, and the pushback was fierce. The conflict wasn't just in the classroom, it was everywhere. The more she uncovered, the more Ava realized just how deeply ingrained these narratives were in society. She wasn't just fighting to uncover forgotten history. She was challenging an entire system that had built its identity on a version of history that erased her own. And yet, Ava couldn't walk away. No matter how much the world pushed back, she knew this was the path she was meant to follow. Her journey was only just beginning. As the weeks went by, Ava's research began to take on a life of its own. What started as a personal project, born out of a need to understand her own identity and the historical roots of black people, was evolving into something far bigger than she had ever imagined. The resistance she faced only fueled her determination to continue. But now, Ava knew it wasn't just about uncovering a hidden history, it was about challenging the very foundations of what people thought they knew about the Bible and history itself. One night, she sat alone in the dimly lit library, surrounded by ancient texts and scribbled notes. The world outside seemed distant, irrelevant to the mission she had embraced. Ava's fingertips ran across a worn page of an ancient Ethiopian manuscript. It was one of the earliest translations of the Bible, and it contained fascinating, often overlooked details about African involvement in biblical history. This was the breakthrough she had been waiting for. She had already discovered that the Queen of Sheba, often seen as a figure of mystery and foreignness in Western interpretations of the Bible, was from a powerful African kingdom. The land of Sheba, now part of modern-day Ethiopia and Yemen, had been a thriving civilization. Ava had uncovered evidence suggesting that the Queen's visit to King Solomon wasn't just a diplomatic mission, it was a powerful exchange between two great leaders, one from the African continent and one from Israel. But there was more, much more. Ava's latest discovery was staggering, the presence of African tribes in the Exodus narrative. The Bible, in its traditional interpretation, had largely ignored the deep African connection to Moses and the Israelites. But Ava had stumbled upon a fascinating article by an African historian, who suggested that the story of Moses' exile in Egypt and his return to lead the Israelites out of slavery was steeped in African tradition. This wasn't just a story of an enslaved people, it was a story of the African diaspora, where people of African descent had shaped the very fabric of the biblical narrative. Ava's pulse raced as she connected the dots. Moses' experiences in Egypt weren't isolated incidents. The entire story of Exodus was tied to a broader history of African people in the Middle East and the Mediterranean. The Israelites were not isolated from African civilizations, in fact, they had been heavily influenced by them. Moses' wife, Zipporah, was Ethiopian. An undeniable link between the African continent and the birth of the Jewish people. The more Ava uncovered, the more she realized the full extent of the Bible's African connections. But she also began to understand the gravity of what she was doing. She was unraveling narratives that had been set in stone for centuries. The religious community, the academic world, and society at large were all built on these conventional stories, and what she was finding challenged everything. One evening, as Ava was preparing to share her findings with a larger audience, she received an unexpected message. It was from an online historian named Elijah Grant, someone she had followed for years but never met in person. Elijah was known for his controversial takes on historical events, often challenging mainstream narratives about race, religion, and history. His message was simple: "I've been following your work. It's time we talk." Ava's heart skipped a beat. Elijah Grant was a bold figure in the world of historical research. His work often pushed the boundaries of conventional thought. He had publicly questioned the historical absence of black figures in the Bible and had criticized the mainstream academic world for downplaying African contributions to biblical history. He was controversial, but he was also one of the few voices that spoke with the same passion and urgency that Ava felt. The next morning, they met at a small coffee shop in Atlanta. Elijah was a man of striking presence, with a calm demeanor that contrasted sharply with the intensity of his online persona. He was in his early 40s, tall, with a well-groomed beard, and his eyes sparkled with the kind of intellectual curiosity that made him magnetic. "Ava," Elijah began, taking a sip of his coffee. "I've been following your research. You're onto something big here, something that's going to shake the foundations of history as we know it." Ava nodded, her thoughts swirling. "I know. But it's not just history, it's the narrative that surrounds our identity. People don't want to accept the truth that black people were not only present in the Bible but were pivotal figures in shaping it. It's like they've erased us from the story." Elijah leaned forward, his voice low but intense. "That's exactly it. What we're up against isn't just an academic wall, it's a cultural and religious one. The mainstream narrative has been crafted and reinforced for centuries, and it's a narrative that excludes us. But we can't let that stop us. The truth needs to be told." Ava felt a surge of hope at his words. For so long, she had felt like a lone voice in the wilderness, but now, in Elijah's presence, she understood that she wasn't alone in this fight. He understood the stakes. He had been fighting this battle for years, trying to open people's eyes to the African history that had been buried within religious texts. But even Elijah wasn't immune to the pressure. "The academic world won't make it easy for you," Elijah warned. "I know firsthand how hard it is to push back against established narratives. They'll label you a radical, a revisionist, a troublemaker. But the truth doesn't care about labels. It just is." Ava exhaled deeply. "I know the risks. I've been getting pushback from my professors, my peers. I even had an email exchange with Dr. Foster. She called my work dangerous." Elijah smiled knowingly. "She's not the first, and she won't be the last. But it's not about them. It's about us, about giving our people back their rightful place in history. The truth is dangerous because it challenges the very structure of power that has kept us in the shadows." For the first time in months, Ava felt a sense of camaraderie, a feeling that she wasn't fighting this battle alone. Together, they could push back against the walls that had been built around their history. They could tell the story of the African presence in the Bible, a story that had been hidden for far too long. Over the next few weeks, Ava and Elijah worked together, sharing their findings and refining their arguments. The research came alive in a new way, filled with urgency and purpose. They began planning a public lecture, a way to challenge the mainstream narrative and educate a wider audience about the African figures who had shaped biblical history. Ava had never been more determined in her life. But as the lecture date drew closer, the reality of what they were attempting to do began to sink in. They were about to disrupt an entire worldview. And the more they pushed forward, the more they realized just how high the stakes had become. Would they succeed in uncovering the truth, or would they be silenced by those who had the power to maintain the status quo? One thing was certain, Ava had come too far to turn back now. She was about to step into the spotlight, and the world was about to learn the truth. The day of the lecture arrived, and Ava stood at the podium, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the microphone. The large lecture hall at the university was filled with curious faces, some eager to hear what she had uncovered, others skeptical, and a few openly hostile. She could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her, but she was resolute. This was her moment, the culmination of months of sleepless nights, research, and battles both internal and external. Elijah sat in the front row, his steady gaze offering her a quiet sense of support. Despite the nervous energy coursing through her, Ava felt a sense of calm wash over her as she looked at him. She wasn't alone in this fight. She had his unwavering belief, and that gave her strength. "Good evening, everyone," Ava began, her voice steady but filled with an intensity that made the room fall silent. "Tonight, we're going to talk about something that has been hidden for far too long, the African presence in the Bible. For centuries, certain figures, certain stories, have been erased or downplayed. But the truth has always been there, waiting to be rediscovered." She paused, scanning the room. A few heads nodded, while others exchanged glances, as if unsure what to expect. Ava felt the pressure mounting, but she pushed forward. "I know this is a controversial topic. I know that for many of you, what I'm about to share will challenge everything you've been taught. But I urge you to listen with an open mind. Because the history of the Bible is not just a story of the Middle East, of Europe, or of Israel. It's a story that spans continents, cultures, and people of all races." Ava took a deep breath, then dove into the heart of her presentation, outlining the African figures in the Bible who had been marginalized for centuries. She began with the Queen of Sheba, showing how the African ruler's visit to King Solomon was not just a chance meeting, but a significant exchange between two powerful civilizations. She spoke of the biblical figure of Cush, whose descendants played a pivotal role in the development of ancient Israel. And then there was Moses, a figure that had been stripped of his African identity in the mainstream narrative. "African history is embedded in the very fabric of the Bible," Ava said, her voice growing stronger with each word. Moses' wife, Zipporah, was Ethiopian. The ancient Egyptians were Africans, and their influence on the Israelites is undeniable. The Exodus, that story of liberation, is a story of Africans leading and shaping a nation. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of disbelief and curiosity. Ava could see that the seeds of doubt had been planted. She wasn't just presenting historical facts, she was unraveling a narrative that had shaped generations of people who had grown up believing a singular, narrow version of history. But the tension in the room was palpable. She could feel the resistance, the challenge that lay ahead. As she moved through her research, Ava began to reveal even more profound connections, how African traditions and wisdom had been passed down through the generations and had influenced the early Christian church. The Ethiopian eunuch who converted to Christianity in the Book of Acts. The role of the early African church fathers in shaping Christian doctrine. Ava spoke passionately, her voice cutting through the skepticism, urging her audience to recognize the significance of black presence in the Bible as foundational to the faith. But just as she was reaching the peak of her lecture, something unexpected happened. A man in the back of the room stood up, interrupting her. "This is nonsense," he said, his voice loud and filled with derision. "You can't just rewrite history to fit your own narrative. The Bible isn't about race. It's about salvation and God's plan. What you're doing is dangerous. You're spreading lies, and you need to stop." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Ava's heart raced. This was the moment she feared, the moment when the backlash became too personal. The man's words stung, but they weren't new. She had heard this kind of opposition before, both online and in the academic world. What was different now was the weight of the audience's gaze. She felt the eyes of everyone in the room, some sympathetic, some unsure, and some clearly aligned with the man's views. For a split second, Ava considered backing down, retreating to the comfort of the familiar. But the thought of her years of hard work, the countless hours spent digging into forgotten corners of history, flashed before her eyes. No. She couldn't stop now. She took a deep breath and spoke again, her voice calm but unshakable. I understand that this may be difficult to accept, she said. I understand that for many, this challenges the very foundation of what they've been taught. But the truth is not something we can ignore because it's uncomfortable. If we truly seek understanding, if we truly want to honor the history of every person, we have to acknowledge that history in its fullness. And yes, that means recognizing the contributions of Africans in the Bible. Ava's words seemed to hang in the air, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, another voice rose from the crowd, a woman this time. What if you're right? She asked. What if we've been looking at the Bible all wrong? Ava smiled, her confidence growing with each passing second. That's the point. We can't change the past, but we can change the way we view it. We can learn from it. And in doing so, we can bring truth to the forefront. This is about honoring the fullness of our shared history. The man who had interrupted her glared, but he didn't speak again. The rest of the room was quieter now, a mixture of contemplation and curiosity replacing the hostility. As the lecture concluded, Ava felt a sense of relief wash over her. She had said what needed to be said. She had done what she came to do. But she knew this was only the beginning. What had just happened in that room was more than just an academic discussion, it was the spark of something much larger. She had opened a door, and whether they liked it or not, the world was going to walk through it. But as Ava stepped down from the podium and walked toward Elijah, she knew that this victory was bittersweet. The journey ahead would be harder than ever. The forces she was up against weren't just academic, they were cultural, religious, and deeply entrenched in society's view of the world. But Ava was no longer afraid. She had found her voice, and now, there was no turning back. The days following the lecture felt like a blur. Ava couldn't remember the last time she had been so emotionally drained, yet so alive. The lecture had been a success in ways she couldn't have anticipated. Though there were some who had walked out, shaking their heads in disbelief, there were also those who had stayed behind, asking questions, wanting to know more, and, most importantly, opening their minds to a new perspective. For Ava, that was the win. But she knew the real battle was just beginning. As she sat at her desk in the quiet of her apartment, her mind raced. She had spent years working on this project, meticulously piecing together historical evidence, exploring religious texts, and challenging traditional interpretations. But now, with the lecture over, the reality of what lay ahead hit her full force. This wasn't just about getting her research published, it was about changing the narrative, a task that would require far more than just facts and figures. She would need to face opposition from every angle, from academia, from religious communities, and from those who were simply too invested in the old narrative to let go. A knock at her door broke her reverie. When Ava opened it, she was met by Elijah, his face carrying the same mix of pride and concern that Ava had come to recognize in their brief partnership. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, as if he knew exactly what Ava needed. That was incredible, he said, his voice full of admiration. You did it. You got through to them. Ava smiled wearily, sinking into the couch. I don't know, Elijah. Some of them were so angry. Some were really uncomfortable. I could see it in their eyes. But the ones who stayed, those are the ones who matter. Elijah nodded, sitting across from her. Exactly. The ones who stayed. You've planted the seed. It's going to take time, but that seed is powerful. And trust me, people are already talking. I've gotten messages all day from people in the audience. Some didn't know how to process it, but they're thinking. That's what we want. Ava rubbed her forehead, exhaustion weighing on her. But how do we move forward from here? I'm just one person. I can't change the world by myself. Elijah leaned forward, his eyes serious now. You're not alone. You've got me. You've got others who believe in this work. More importantly, you've got the truth on your side. And the truth is something that can't be buried forever. The fact that they're angry, that's a good thing. It means they're uncomfortable. It means we've hit a nerve. The more we push, the more people will have to confront the reality. Ava looked at him, feeling a weight lift slightly from her shoulders. But what about the pushback? What if they try to discredit me? What if the religious community comes after me for this? They already are, Elijah said quietly. But you've got something they can't argue with, facts. History. And the courage to stand by it. They'll try to dismiss you. They'll call you a revisionist, an outsider, a threat. But the thing is, you're not rewriting history. You're reclaiming it. And they can't stop that. Ava took a deep breath, her hands still trembling slightly. I've been thinking about it. Maybe it's time to write a book. A full-length exploration of the African presence in the Bible. Not just for scholars, but for the general public. People need to understand the historical context and see how much they've been missing. How much we've been missing. Elijah smiled, his eyes gleaming with approval. That's exactly what I was thinking. A book would give you a platform to spread your work, and it would solidify everything you've done. People will take you seriously. Especially once they see the depth of your research. Ava nodded, determination rekindling in her. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to stop now. Writing the book wouldn't just be about proving a point. It would be about building a bridge, connecting the dots between African history and the Bible, between a marginalized people and their rightful place in the larger narrative. But she knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. The academic world would try to discredit her. Religious institutions would likely dismiss her work as blasphemy. Some would even accuse her of attacking the foundations of faith. She had already seen that kind of backlash in the aftermath of her lecture. But Ava wasn't afraid anymore. She understood the stakes, and she was ready. Over the next few weeks, Ava threw herself into her writing. She spent countless hours at her desk, sorting through research, reading ancient texts, and compiling her findings into a cohesive argument. Elijah was there every step of the way, reviewing her drafts, offering guidance, and pushing her to go even deeper. Together, they crafted a narrative that would shake the foundations of how people viewed both history and the Bible. Ava's book, The Hidden Legacy, The African Presence in the Bible, began to take shape. It was more than just a historical examination, it was a call to action. A challenge to the world to reconsider everything they thought they knew about religion, race, and the origins of civilization. Ava knew it would be controversial. She knew there would be backlash. But she was determined to make it impossible for anyone to ignore the truth. And then, one day, after what felt like an eternity of research, writing, and editing, Ava finished the manuscript. She sat back in her chair, staring at the screen. It was done. Her book was ready to be sent out into the world. Elijah called her that evening. "How are you feeling?" Ava laughed, though there was a hint of exhaustion in her voice. "Relieved. And a little scared." "That's normal," Elijah replied. "But you've done the hard part. Now it's time to share it with the world." Ava smiled. She had done it. She had taken the first step toward changing the world's understanding of Black history and its connection to the Bible. And though the road ahead would be full of challenges, she was ready to face them. She knew that the journey was far from over, but she had already taken the most important step, she had found her voice, and now, nothing could silence her. The weeks after Ava finished her manuscript were some of the longest of her life. She submitted her book to multiple publishers, some of whom expressed cautious interest, while others quickly rejected her work, citing concerns about the controversial nature of her topic. Despite the setbacks, Ava refused to back down. She knew that the truth she was presenting could not be ignored forever. This was bigger than her, it was about reshaping history, changing the way the world viewed its origins. But Ava had underestimated how powerful her voice would become. Word of her book began to spread. The academic community, which had initially dismissed her research, started to take notice. Scholars from various fields began discussing her ideas, some in support, others in opposition. It was the kind of attention Ava had both desired and feared. It all started when a popular historian and professor, Dr. Michael Graham, who had previously written extensively on the history of Christianity, referenced Ava's work in one of his lectures. His comments were neither dismissive nor completely approving, instead, he raised valid points about her conclusions and the implications for traditional religious scholarship. "I'm not sure I agree with all of Ava's points," Dr. Graham said in a public lecture at a major academic conference, "but her research undeniably challenges some of our assumptions about the African role in biblical history. And that's something we can't ignore. It's a topic that deserves further exploration." This was a breakthrough for Ava. The fact that someone of Dr. Graham's stature was engaging with her work meant that her research had crossed a threshold. She was no longer just a lone voice, she was part of a larger academic conversation. Elijah had been keeping a close eye on the news surrounding Ava's book. He had always believed in her, but even he was surprised by how quickly things were moving. "They're talking about you," Elijah said one evening, as he looked through the growing number of mentions of Ava online. "This is it. It's starting to happen." Ava wasn't sure whether to feel exhilarated or terrified. The storm she had unleashed was only beginning. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of interviews, media appearances, and heated debates. There were moments of triumph, like when Ava was invited to speak at an international conference on African history, but there were also moments of intense backlash. The church, particularly conservative factions, decried her work, accusing her of undermining the Bible and challenging centuries of tradition. Some of her former colleagues dismissed her as a revisionist and a radical. Despite the backlash, Ava remained steadfast. She had learned not to let the harsh words of others cloud her mission. What was far more important to her now was the support she was receiving from people who had long been silenced, the Black community. She received messages from people who had never before considered the African presence in the Bible, but after reading her work, they felt empowered. They felt seen. One day, Ava received an unexpected email. It was from an influential pastor, Reverend Samuel Peters, who had built a reputation for progressive theological views within his denomination. He had read her book and was moved by it. His congregation had recently started an initiative to better understand the African roots of Christianity, and he was inviting Ava to speak at a special service he was hosting. Ava's heart skipped a beat. She had never expected to be invited by the church, especially not after the fierce opposition she had faced from some quarters. But Reverend Peter's invitation wasn't just an opportunity for her to speak, it was a sign that change was starting to take root in places she never imagined. The service was held in a large church in Atlanta, with hundreds of people in attendance. The congregation was diverse, with black and white faces alike, all eager to hear from Ava. As she walked up to the pulpit, she was overcome with a sense of awe. The journey that had begun with the publication of her book had brought her to this pivotal moment. Reverend Peters introduced her to the congregation with words of praise. "Ava's work is not just about challenging historical narratives," he said, "but about honoring the contributions of those who have been erased from our collective memory. It's about recognizing the Black presence in the Bible that has long been overlooked. It's about reclaiming the truth." Ava stood there for a moment, taking in the weight of the moment. She had anticipated this moment would be filled with opposition, that the church would push back against her ideas. But instead, she was greeted with respect, with curiosity, and with a deep sense of reverence for the work she had done. It was a validation that she hadn't expected, but that she desperately needed. As she spoke to the congregation, Ava felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. She was no longer just a scholar, no longer just a researcher. She was part of a movement, one that sought to restore the truth and ensure that the African presence in the Bible was no longer hidden or ignored. She talked about the ancient African civilizations that had shaped biblical history, the figures who had been erased, and the profound impact that recognition could have on modern faith. When she finished speaking, there was a standing ovation. She couldn't help but feel a swell of emotion. It was one thing to speak to a room full of academics, it was another to speak to people whose lives had been shaped by these narratives, people who were hungry for the truth she was offering. The media coverage following her appearance was explosive. Major news outlets began to reach out for interviews, and Ava's book sales skyrocketed. But what surprised her the most was the reaction from people she had never expected. Members of the Black community, who had long felt disconnected from biblical history, began sharing their own stories of rediscovery. One woman wrote to Ava, saying, "Your book changed my life. I grew up believing that the Bible wasn't for people like me. But now I understand my place in the story. I am part of something much bigger than I ever realized." Ava had begun her journey wanting to change history, to uncover the hidden truths of the Bible. But she had never imagined that her work would go beyond just reshaping historical narratives. It was now about empowering people to see themselves in the story, to reclaim their identity and their place in the larger narrative of faith and history. As Ava reflected on all of this, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for the path she had chosen. It hadn't been easy, and the road ahead was still uncertain. But she knew that she had started something that could never be undone. She had ignited the first sparks of change, and now there was no turning back. Ava woke up to a flood of emails the morning after her speech at Reverend Peter's church. Her inbox was a battleground, praise and support from unexpected places on one hand, and scathing criticism and threats on the other. The media coverage of her appearance had been a double-edged sword. While she had reached countless people, including those she never thought would give her a chance, the backlash from the more conservative sectors was growing louder. Her phone buzzed incessantly, more calls from reporters and talk show hosts eager to get her thoughts. Among the messages, there were also several angry emails accusing her of spreading falsehoods, of undermining the sanctity of the Bible, and even accusing her of being a part of a conspiracy to erase Christian history. The more hostile voices made it clear they saw her as a threat. A threat to the traditional narrative they had upheld for centuries. Ava felt her pulse quicken as she opened one particular email from a well-known Christian author, Dr. William Carter, whose books had been bestsellers in religious communities. He had publicly denounced her work on a popular conservative podcast. "You are playing a dangerous game," Dr. Carter had written. "Your so-called research challenges the very foundation of our faith. What you're doing is not just rewriting history, it's an attack on Christianity itself. The Bible is clear, and your attempts to distort it will not go unchallenged. Prepare yourself for the consequences." Ava felt the weight of his words. She knew she was stirring the pot, but she had never expected such a fierce, personal attack. The pressure was mounting, and the world she had once known seemed to be closing in on her. It was easy to feel isolated in this battle. But Ava had come too far to retreat now. She had a mission, and she couldn't let fear control her actions. Elijah had been trying to reach her all morning, but Ava hadn't answered his calls. She needed time to process everything, to think. Eventually, she called him back. "Hey," Elijah said, his voice full of concern. "I saw the backlash. How are you holding up?" Ava let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. "I'm okay, but I've got to be honest, I didn't expect it to get this intense. I thought people would push back, but this feels personal. Like I've become the enemy of something much bigger than I imagined. I know it's tough right now, but I need you to remember why you started this. You're telling the truth, Ava. And the truth will always make waves, especially when it's not the truth people want to hear. It's not going to be easy, but the fight you're in, it's a worthy one. Ava stood by her window, looking out at the city below. The sun was setting, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink. It felt peaceful, yet everything around her felt like chaos. But Elijah's words had a grounding effect on her. She had to keep going. The truth mattered more than her own comfort. "You're right," she said, her voice steadying. "I can't back down now. I've already started something, and it's bigger than me. This isn't just about me. It's about the people who are being silenced, the people who deserve to have their history recognized. I won't let their stories be erased." Elijah smiled through the phone. "That's the spirit. You've got this. And don't forget, I'm right here with you every step of the way." The next few days were filled with interviews. Ava's public persona was starting to take shape, not just as an academic, but as a bold figure in a much larger debate about race, religion, and history. As the attacks continued, so did the support. Ava found herself in the middle of a cultural storm, one that she hadn't fully anticipated. A particularly heated debate occurred on a national talk show, where Ava was invited to discuss her work. The host, a renowned conservative commentator named Jennifer Mallory, grilled her on the supposed dangerous implications of her research. "Your claims about the African presence in the Bible are not just historical inaccuracies, Ava," Jennifer said, her voice cutting through the studio's tension. "You're undermining the very fabric of Christianity. You're teaching people to question what has been handed down for centuries. Don't you think you're playing with fire?" Ava's heart raced, but she kept her composure. "Jennifer, I'm not trying to dismantle anyone's faith. What I'm doing is exposing a truth that has been hidden for far too long. The Bible is not a Western document. It is a product of many cultures, including African ones. My research simply shows that the contributions of black people to the Bible have been erased or overlooked. It's time to correct that." Jennifer's face hardened, but the audience's reaction was mixed, some looked uncomfortable, others intrigued. Ava could feel the tension crackling in the air. This was more than just a conversation about the Bible, it was a confrontation about the very nature of history itself. Throughout the interview, Ava maintained her calm, answering every question with a quiet strength. By the end of the segment, she knew she had made an impact. The conversation around her work had shifted, it was no longer just about the controversy of black figures in the Bible. It was now about whether people were ready to face the uncomfortable truths of history. The interview ended, and as Ava walked off the set, she was met with applause from some members of the production crew. They had witnessed her poise under fire. But the battle was far from over. In the weeks that followed, the stakes only grew higher. As her book sales soared, so did the attempts to discredit her. The internet was flooded with videos and articles calling her a liar, a fraud, a revisionist. It wasn't just academics or religious leaders anymore, now, even ordinary people were attacking her online. Yet in the midst of all the criticism, something began to shift. Ava received more and more messages from people who felt seen, who finally understood their place in the biblical story. One message in particular stuck with her. It was from a young woman named Marissa, who had grown up questioning her own identity in relation to her faith. "I always wondered where I fit in the Bible," Marissa wrote. "I knew there was something missing, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Your book opened my eyes. Now, I feel like I belong. I am part of the story, just as much as anyone else." It was messages like these that fueled Ava's resolve. The world would fight her, but the truth would always find its way through the cracks. She would not be silenced. She would continue speaking, continue challenging the status quo, and continue fighting for those whose voices had been erased. The winds of opposition were strong, but Ava knew they were the winds of change. And she was determined to keep moving forward. As the weeks passed, the controversy surrounding Ava's book grew. The debates, the media frenzy, and the constant pushback from the religious establishment weren't just tiring, they were taking a toll on Ava's personal life. Every moment of peace was interrupted by emails, phone calls, and social media notifications, each carrying a mix of praise and condemnation. She had become a lightning rod for a debate that, at its core, was about more than just history. It was about identity, power, and what people were willing to accept about themselves and their past. Ava had always known this journey would be difficult, but the emotional weight was harder to bear than she had anticipated. She had moments of doubt, where she wondered if the battle was worth the constant scrutiny. Her phone buzzed one morning with a message from Elijah, as it had many times before, but this time the subject line read, "Urgent, we need to talk." Ava felt a tight knot form in her stomach as she opened the email. Elijah had been her rock throughout this entire process, but something about his tone made her uneasy. She picked up the phone and dialed his number. "Elijah, what's going on?" she asked as soon as he picked up. "I think we need to have a serious conversation," Elijah replied, his voice heavy with concern. "There's something happening, something you need to be aware of." Ava leaned against the kitchen counter, suddenly alert. "What's happening?" "It's bigger than just the media or the backlash," Elijah said. "I've been getting calls from people who are, well, they're concerned about your safety. There are whispers. I think things are starting to escalate in ways we can't predict." Ava's pulse quickened. The fear she had pushed down began to surface, uninvited. "What do you mean by, concerned about my safety?" "There are people who don't want your message out there, Ava," Elijah said quietly. "You've stirred the pot in ways that go beyond academia. And now, there are groups, people, who see you as a threat. You need to be careful." Ava stood motionless, absorbing the weight of Elijah's words. This had always been more than just a book or a historical debate. She had stepped into a volatile world, one that was filled with both powerful allies and dangerous enemies. She had anticipated criticism, but now it was clear that the risks were higher than she had ever imagined. "I've been thinking about this for a while," Elijah continued. "You need to make a decision. This isn't just about sharing knowledge anymore. You've ignited something that can't be put out. You need to decide what kind of impact you want to have." Ava closed her eyes, letting his words sink in. She had always been driven by the desire to uncover hidden truths, but now the reality was dawning on her. Truth came with a price. "I understand," she said, her voice firm. "But I won't back down. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about everyone who's been erased from history. I won't let fear dictate what I do." "Just promise me you'll be careful," Elijah urged. "I will," Ava replied, feeling a surge of determination. "But this isn't over. It's just the beginning." That afternoon, Ava found herself alone in her office, staring at the pages of her manuscript. She had never anticipated such an emotional and physical toll. But as the weight of the opposition bore down on her, she also realized the responsibility that came with the ground she had broken. It was clear now that she wasn't just telling a story about the African presence in the Bible, she was igniting a broader conversation about race, power, and the narratives that had been imposed on generations. Her work was not just academic, it was a call to action. The next morning, Ava received another email. This one was different. It was from an organization she had never heard of, a grassroots movement focused on reclaiming Black history and advocating for marginalized communities. The subject line read, "We stand with you." Intrigued, Ava opened it. "We've been following your work, and we believe you are making an important contribution to the way history is taught and understood," the email began. "We represent a network of educators, activists, and community leaders who are working to ensure that the full scope of Black history is acknowledged. We want to help amplify your voice. Let's talk." Ava was stunned. The email was not only supportive but also offered a chance to collaborate. This could be the break she needed, a way to channel her message into something even more impactful. It was the kind of support that could help her push back against the growing opposition. She quickly composed a reply, expressing her eagerness to meet and explore how they could work together. A few days later, she had a video call scheduled with the organization's leader, a charismatic woman named Tamara Williams. The connection was instant, and Tamara's enthusiasm was contagious. "We've been watching you, Ava," Tamara said, her voice filled with urgency. "What you're doing is groundbreaking. You're challenging the status quo, and we're all here for it. But we know you're going to need support to take this further. Our goal is to ensure that Black history is not only taught but honored. That's why we want to partner with you." Ava felt a surge of gratitude. This was the kind of partnership she had longed for, one that could amplify her research and bring it to communities that needed to hear it the most. Together, they could build something powerful. "We need a platform," Tamara continued. "Your work has to reach beyond just books and articles. We need to get the truth to the people, to schools, churches, communities. We need to challenge the narratives that have been in place for centuries." Ava nodded, her mind racing with possibilities. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She wasn't alone anymore. The movement she had ignited was spreading, and now it was time to turn the tides. That evening, as Ava sat in her office, staring at the screen of her laptop, a sense of purpose washed over her. She wasn't just fighting for recognition of the African presence in the Bible anymore, she was leading a movement. The ground was shifting, and with the support of Tamara's organization and the communities she had yet to reach, Ava was ready to take the next step. This was no longer about history. It was about empowerment. It was about people seeing themselves in the stories they had been told for centuries. It was time to act. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The days that followed the meeting with Tamara Williams marked the beginning of a new chapter in Ava's journey. With newfound resolve and the backing of a grassroots organization that was just as passionate about truth as she was, Ava set out to expand her reach. The pressure was still mounting, but now there was a shared sense of purpose that gave her strength. It wasn't just about her anymore, it was about a collective movement, a shared vision for a more honest telling of history, especially Black history. Ava's first step was to engage with the communities she had been advocating for. For too long, Black voices and perspectives had been sidelined in historical narratives, and now it was time to change that. Working alongside Tamara and the network of activists, educators, and leaders, Ava helped organize a series of community forums and educational events. The goal was simple: to bring history to the people in a way that was empowering, educational, and, most importantly, truthful. Ava's first event was held at a community center in one of Chicago's predominantly Black neighborhoods. The room was filled with students, parents, and local leaders who were eager to hear what she had to say. There was a palpable sense of anticipation in the air as she stood before the crowd, ready to speak. For the first time in a long while, Ava felt a deep sense of purpose in what she was doing. She began her speech by acknowledging the weight of the moment. "We've all heard the stories told in our classrooms, in churches, and on TV," she said, her voice steady and strong. "But too often, those stories leave out the contributions, the struggles, and the greatness of Black people throughout history. This is not just about a biblical narrative, this is about reclaiming our place in all of history." The audience was rapt, their eyes fixed on her as she spoke of the long history of African people in the Bible, how figures like Moses, the Queen of Sheba, and even the Ethiopian eunuch were often erased or misrepresented. She shared the research from her book, which detailed the pivotal role that African civilizations had played in shaping the early foundations of Christianity and the Bible itself. One by one, people began to ask questions, their voices filled with curiosity and excitement. Ava could see the shift in their eyes. They were waking up to a new understanding of themselves, their history, and their place in the world. They had long been told they were secondary to the dominant narrative, but here, in this room, they were being given the tools to rewrite that narrative. After the event, Ava stayed to chat with several attendees. One woman, an older teacher named Ms. Jenkins, approached her with tears in her eyes. I've been teaching history for over 30 years, Ms. Jenkins said, her voice trembling. But I've never been able to fully share the stories I know are true. We've been told to sanitize everything, to fit it into a neat little box. Your work is finally giving us permission to tell the whole story. Thank you. Ava felt a lump form in her throat. It was moments like this that reminded her why she couldn't back down. This wasn't just about academic debates or media headlines. This was about real people, their lives, and their stories. These were the moments that made the fight worthwhile. In the following weeks, Ava continued to travel and speak, bringing her message to more and more communities. She was invited to churches, schools, and community centers, where she spoke passionately about the importance of historical accuracy and the need for every person, especially people of color, to see themselves in the narratives they were taught. But as Ava's movement grew, so did the opposition. The conservative backlash against her work intensified. More and more public figures came forward, accusing her of promoting a revisionist agenda and spreading lies about the Bible. Talk show hosts and media outlets that had once been neutral or even supportive began to align themselves with the conservative voices condemning her. One evening, while scrolling through her social media feed, Ava saw a post from Dr. William Carter, the well-known Christian author who had first criticized her work. His latest post was filled with fiery rhetoric, claiming that Ava was leading people down a dangerous path, and that her research was part of a larger plot to undermine the Christian faith. Ava's heart sank as she read the words. She had expected backlash, but seeing it so personal and so public stung in a way she hadn't anticipated. She was no longer just an academic or an author, she was a target, a symbol of everything these people feared. But it wasn't just the criticism from religious conservatives that worried her, it was the subtle threats that had started to appear in her inbox. While they weren't direct, the tone was unmistakable. There were messages from people warning her to stop playing with fire and stay in her lane. Some even hinted at darker consequences for her continued advocacy. Ava had long known that speaking the truth was dangerous. But now, she felt the weight of it more than ever. She looked at her phone, the messages still flooding in, and felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. She had been relentlessly pushing forward for so long, but now, it was harder to ignore the toll it was taking on her mental and emotional health. She didn't know how much longer she could go on like this. That night, she called Elijah. She needed someone to talk to, someone who understood what she was going through. "Hey, it's me," she said when he answered. "I know you're probably swamped," Elijah said gently. "But I've been thinking a lot about you lately. How are you really doing?" Ava let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Honestly? I'm tired, Elijah. I'm exhausted. The work we're doing is so important, but it feels like every time I take a step forward, there's another hurdle. And now I'm starting to get scared. Not just for myself, but for the people who are supporting me. They're getting caught up in this too." Elijah's voice softened. "Ava, I get it. The weight of everything you're doing, it's a lot. But don't forget why you started. You have a responsibility to yourself and to those people who are standing with you to keep going. Your voice is powerful. You're sparking something bigger than you." Ava took a deep breath, her hands shaking slightly as she gripped the phone. "I can't let fear stop me. I won't. There's too much at stake. But I need to figure out how to handle all of this. How to keep going, even when it feels like the world is against me." "Elijah's right," a new voice said from behind her. It was Tamara, who had arrived unannounced. "You're not alone in this, Ava. You've got people who have your back, who are ready to help take this movement to the next level." Ava turned to see Tamara standing in the doorway of her apartment, a determined look on her face. "Together, we can handle whatever comes our way," Tamara said. "You've ignited something powerful, and it's only just beginning." Ava looked between Elijah and Tamara, the weight of their support anchoring her in the midst of the storm. For the first time in a while, she felt a sense of peace. She wasn't alone. She had a mission, and she wasn't going to back down. The movement she had started was bigger than any threat, any obstacle. She would see it through, no matter the cost. The following weeks brought both growth and greater challenges for Ava. As her movement gained traction, more and more people reached out to her, students, educators, and even religious leaders, expressing their support. But just as the positive momentum seemed unstoppable, new threats emerged, both on the personal and public fronts. One afternoon, as Ava was preparing for a major speaking event at a large church in New York City, she received an unexpected phone call. The number was unfamiliar, and she almost didn't pick it up, but something told her to answer. "Ava, it's Dr. Jonathan Pierce," the voice on the other end said, a calm, deep tone. "We need to talk." Ava paused. Dr. Pierce was a prominent theologian and biblical scholar, known for his conservative views on the interpretation of Scripture. He had publicly criticized Ava's work in the past, even accusing her of promoting dangerous and divisive ideas. His call was a surprise. She had assumed he would remain one of her most vocal detractors. "Why are you calling me?" Ava asked cautiously. "I'm not calling as your critic, Ava," Dr. Pierce replied. "I'm calling because I think you're on to something important, and I believe your research needs a fair platform. I think you need someone who understands the theological implications of what you're presenting." Ava's mind raced. She knew Dr. Pierce's views. He was the epitome of the conservative religious establishment. He had written books that decried anything he considered a misinterpretation of Scripture. His public stance had often been one of condemnation, so why was he calling her now, out of the blue, offering his support? "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "I know this may seem unexpected," Dr. Pierce continued, "but I believe there's a truth here that we can't ignore. I think we're living in a moment where the church needs to take a hard look at its history and its relationship to race. The narrative has been skewed for far too long, and while I don't agree with everything in your work, I think we both agree on one fundamental point: the erasure of black people from biblical history is a problem." Ava sat back in her chair, trying to process what was happening. "So, you're saying you're willing to help me?" "I wouldn't go that far," Dr. Pierce chuckled, though there was a seriousness in his tone. "But I am willing to help you ensure that your research gets a fair hearing. This issue is too important for it to be dismissed because of political or social agendas. If we truly want to honor the biblical tradition, we need to confront the uncomfortable truths about our history. I believe we need a dialogue, not a battle." Ava was stunned. The idea of collaborating with Dr. Pierce seemed unthinkable, yet here he was, willing to engage in a conversation that could bridge some of the ideological divides that had been entrenched for centuries. "I'm willing to listen," Ava replied cautiously. "But you should know, I'm not backing down. This isn't just a debate, I'm fighting for real change." "I understand," he said. "And I respect that. You're challenging some long-held assumptions, and that's not easy. But sometimes, it takes an unexpected ally to push the conversation forward." The conversation left Ava with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear: Dr. Pierce's offer of dialogue was a game-changer. She knew this was a rare opportunity, one that could open doors to broader conversations within the church and the academic community. If she could somehow bridge the gap between her work and the traditionalists, she might be able to achieve something greater than she had imagined. The days that followed Dr. Pierce's call were filled with a whirlwind of activity. Ava's calendar was packed with interviews, speaking events, and meetings with new allies. She was still grappling with the implications of Dr. Pierce's offer, and the conflicting emotions it stirred in her. The idea of engaging with someone who had publicly opposed her felt unsettling, but there was also a part of her that knew this could be the breakthrough she needed. That night, as she prepared for another community forum, she received a message from Tamara. The subject line read, "We need to talk. Urgent." Ava's stomach tightened as she opened it. "Ava, we've been hearing some disturbing news," the message began. "There's been a surge in anti-black protests, particularly from some church groups who are aligning with right-wing extremists. They're planning to disrupt your upcoming speaking events. You need to be careful. I know we've talked about these kinds of things before, but it's escalating fast. Ava read the message over and over, her mind spinning. She had known that her movement was controversial, but the idea of her events being targeted by extremists was a new and terrifying reality. She couldn't allow fear to paralyze her, but she also couldn't ignore the risk. The next morning, Ava had a video call scheduled with Dr. Pierce. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she needed clarity. If he truly wanted to be an ally, now was the time to prove it. When the call began, Dr. Pierce's expression was solemn. "Ava, I don't want to alarm you," he said, his voice low, "but I've been hearing reports about protests scheduled at your upcoming events. I've even heard that there are groups planning to disrupt these talks with violence. This is a very real threat." Ava felt a chill run down her spine. "What are you saying? Are you telling me to cancel my events?" "Not at all," he replied quickly. "I'm saying you need to be prepared. And more than that, you need to ensure your safety and the safety of your supporters. I can't make these people go away, but I can help you secure your venues and protect your message. I have connections within the church and the broader religious community. We can work together to ensure that your message isn't drowned out by chaos." Ava felt a mix of relief and wariness. Dr. Pierce was offering more than just academic support, he was offering protection. It was something she never imagined she would need, but now that it was on the table, it was hard to turn down. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "You've been one of my harshest critics. How can I trust you?" "I understand your skepticism," Dr. Pierce said. "But sometimes, Ava, we have to put our differences aside and focus on the bigger picture. This isn't just about your book. It's about truth, and it's about making sure that people hear that truth." Ava sat in silence for a moment, processing the weight of his words. It wasn't just about her work anymore, it was about something much larger than she had ever imagined. "I'll accept your help," she said finally. "But this doesn't mean I'm compromising on my message. I won't back down." "I wouldn't ask you to," Dr. Pierce replied, his tone respectful. "This is your fight, Ava. I'm just here to help you fight it more effectively." As the call ended, Ava stared at the screen, feeling a mixture of uncertainty and resolve. She knew this was a pivotal moment, one that could change the course of her mission. It was no longer just about sharing knowledge, it was about surviving in a hostile environment and finding unexpected allies along the way. This was a battle, but it was a battle worth fighting. Ava stood at the front of the church in New York City, staring out at the sea of faces in front of her. It was her largest speaking event yet, a moment she had worked tirelessly for. But today, the stakes felt higher. The weight of everything, the backlash, the protests, the threats, was bearing down on her. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. This wasn't just another speech. This was the culmination of everything she had fought for. As she scanned the audience, she saw a mixture of familiar faces, community members who had been with her from the start, and newcomers, people who had heard about her work and wanted to be part of something bigger. They were here because they believed in the truth she was sharing, a truth that was stirring up the very foundations of traditional narratives. The event had been going smoothly so far. Ava spoke passionately about the erasure of black people in biblical history, pointing to historical figures like Moses, the Queen of Sheba, and others who had been sidelined in mainstream religious teachings. She talked about the importance of reclaiming black history, not just for the sake of black people, but for the sake of the larger human story. But the tension in the air was palpable. There had been whispers of protests outside the church, organized by radical religious groups and right-wing extremists who had vowed to shut her down. Ava had been briefed on the potential disruptions, but she refused to be intimidated. She had come too far, and this moment was too important. As Ava approached the climax of her speech, she heard a loud crash from the back of the room. A group of protesters had entered the building, shouting obscenities and accusations. The audience tensed, murmurs spreading quickly as security rushed to intercept them. "Shut her down," one of the protesters shouted. "This is blasphemy." Ava felt her pulse quicken, but she didn't let the chaos rattle her. Instead, she raised her hand, signaling for the crowd to calm down. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat as she stepped forward, her voice unwavering. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her words cutting through the noise. "This is exactly what we're here to address. The fear, the hostility, the anger that comes with challenging the status quo. This is a reminder of why this work is so important. The truth is a powerful thing, and when we start exposing it, people get uncomfortable. But that discomfort is necessary. It's how we grow." The protesters shouted louder, but Ava didn't back down. She continued to speak, her voice steady, as the crowd began to support her with their applause. "The truth has been hidden for too long," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "And today, we're here to bring that truth into the light, no matter how uncomfortable it makes some people feel." Just as the protesters were about to charge toward the stage, Dr. Pierce stepped into the room, flanked by a group of church leaders. His presence was commanding. He walked straight up to the protesters, his voice booming with authority. "Enough," Dr. Pierce said, his eyes locked on the group causing the disturbance. "You will not disrupt this event. Not today." The protesters hesitated, clearly taken aback by the unexpected intervention. For a moment, the room stood still, the tension hanging thick in the air. But Dr. Pierce didn't back down. "This is a space for dialogue, not violence. If you're here to listen, then listen. If you're here to fight, then you'll have to do it somewhere else." Ava watched in amazement as the protesters, stunned into silence by Dr. Pierce's authority, slowly backed away. The room exhaled in unison, and the energy shifted. Ava gave Dr. Pierce a grateful nod. She hadn't expected him to show up in person, but his presence was exactly what the event needed. It was a turning point, a signal that even the staunchest critics were beginning to recognize the importance of what she was doing. As the protesters filed out of the room, Ava continued her speech, now with a renewed sense of purpose. She had crossed a threshold. The people who had come to shut her down had only strengthened her resolve. She wasn't just advocating for historical accuracy anymore, she was fighting for the very right to speak the truth, no matter the cost. When the event finally ended, the applause was deafening. Ava felt a rush of relief and triumph. She had faced down the opposition, literally, and emerged victorious. But she knew this battle was far from over. The protests, the threats, the critics, they would continue. But Ava was no longer the same woman who had started this journey. She had grown stronger, more resolute. And she was ready for whatever came next. As the crowd dispersed, Ava was approached by a familiar face, one that had become a constant ally throughout this journey. It was Tamara. "That was incredible," Tamara said, her voice filled with admiration. "You handled that so well." Ava smiled, though she was still processing everything that had happened. It was a lot. But it needed to happen. "Absolutely," Tamara agreed. "And the best part is that the message is getting out. People are listening. You've made an impact." Ava's phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out to see a text from Elijah. It read, "I just saw the live stream. Ava, you're changing the game. Keep going. Proud of you." Ava felt a lump form in her throat. She had come so far. And it wasn't just about her anymore, it was about everyone who had been fighting for this truth alongside her. But just as she was beginning to savor the victory, she heard a voice behind her. "Ava?" She turned to see Dr. Pierce standing behind her, his face serious. There was something different in his expression now. He wasn't just the academic adversary anymore. He was a potential partner in this cause. His involvement wasn't a sign of weakness, it was a sign that things were changing. "Ava," he said again, a more somber tone in his voice. "We need to talk." Ava nodded, her curiosity piqued. "About what?" Dr. Pierce looked around the room, making sure no one else was within earshot. "It's about the threats," he said quietly. "We've received intel that things are escalating faster than we anticipated. I'm afraid this won't just be about protests anymore. We need to take extra precautions. I've been in touch with some high-level security experts. We'll make sure you're protected." Ava felt her stomach tighten. The realization that the threats were real and escalating hit her like a ton of bricks. But she also knew that backing down wasn't an option. "We'll take whatever steps are necessary," Ava said, her voice firm. "But we won't stop. Not now. Not ever." Dr. Pierce nodded, a look of respect in his eyes. "I'm with you, Ava. We're in this together now." Ava knew the road ahead would be even more challenging. The stakes had never been higher. But as she stood there, surrounded by people who had become her allies, she felt a renewed sense of strength. This was her moment. And she would not let fear stand in the way of the truth. The cold wind rattled the windows of Ava's apartment as she sat alone, staring at a map of the United States spread across her kitchen table. Dozens of red pins marked cities she had spoken in, each one representing a community awakened, a mind changed, a truth told. But lately, those pins had started to feel like targets. The movement she ignited wasn't slowing down, it was accelerating. And so was the backlash. 3 days ago, a young history teacher in Atlanta who cited Ava's work in her classroom was placed on administrative leave. 2 days ago, a church in Philadelphia that hosted Ava's talk had its windows smashed. And this morning, a college student in Dallas who posted a TikTok defending Ava's message received a death threat. She had expected resistance. She hadn't expected it to become this dangerous, for her and for others. Her phone buzzed on the counter. It was Tamara. "Hey," Ava answered quickly. "Please tell me it's not more bad news." There was a pause on the other end before Tamara spoke. "It's worse." Ava's heart sank. "They've started targeting people close to you. Not just supporters. Family. Elijah told me his mother got a letter yesterday. Handwritten. No return address." Ava gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself. "I'm calling an emergency meeting tonight," Tamara continued. "We can't keep reacting. We need to go on the offensive, with our message, with our security, with everything. Can you be ready in an hour?" "I'll be there," Ava said, her voice tight. "I'm done being afraid." The basement of the community center was packed that night. Activists, scholars, ministers, college students, even a few parents with young children in tow, all had come because they believed in what Ava was doing. Because they were tired of their history being erased. Tamara stood at the front of the room. "This is more than a movement now," she said. "This is a reckoning. And reckonings are messy. They scare people. That's why they're pushing back so hard. But we won't stop." The room buzzed with agreement. Ava stepped forward. Her voice was clear and steady. "They want us to be quiet," she said. "They want us to go away. But what they don't understand is that this isn't just my fight anymore. It belongs to all of us. Every person who has been told their history didn't matter. Every student taught a sanitized version of faith. Every voice silenced." She paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. "We are not going anywhere." A thunder of applause followed. Then, unexpectedly, a familiar voice rose from the back of the room. "If they want a national fight, maybe it's time we give them one." Heads turned. Dr. Jonathan Pierce stepped forward, flanked by 2 colleagues. The room went still. Ava blinked. "You're here." "I said I would support you," Dr. Pierce said, his tone more measured than before. "And now I'm prepared to go further. I've secured a national broadcast slot. A town hall in D.C. 1 month from today. You'll speak. I'll speak. And so will others, supporters, critics, everyone. A real, public conversation. Ava stared at him. You want to share a stage with me? After everything? Yes, he said firmly. Because I've realized something. You're not destroying the faith. You're confronting its omissions. And that might just save it. The room erupted into murmurs. Tamara raised her eyebrows at Ava, who nodded slowly. This wasn't something she would have ever imagined weeks ago. Standing shoulder to shoulder with one of her harshest critics. But here they were, on the same side of history, at least for now. Later that night, Ava sat by the window in her apartment, watching snow drift silently to the ground. Her phone buzzed. It was Elijah. Elijah, saw the live stream. You crushed it. But be careful. They're watching you now more than ever. She stared at his message for a long moment. Then typed back, let them watch. I'm not hiding anymore. Just before midnight, another notification appeared, an anonymous email. Subject, we know where you'll be in DC, watch your back. No message body. Just a black cross. Ava closed the laptop. Her hands trembled, but her mind was clear. The gathering storm wasn't coming. It was already here. And she was ready for it. Washington, D.C. was no stranger to tension. It had hosted generations of protests, parades, and power plays. But as Ava stepped off the train into Union Station, the city felt different. Charged. On edge. The upcoming televised town hall had already ignited a national frenzy. News anchors debated it nightly. Churches split over it. Social media was a battlefield of hashtags and hate. Ava's face was on every screen, usually alongside headlines that read like battle cries. Truth teller or heretic? The Bible's racial reckoning comes to Washington. Ava King, hero or divider? She adjusted her coat and stepped into the brisk wind outside, greeted by her security team and Tamara. They're expecting protests, Tamara said as they walked to the waiting SUV. We've got extra security at the venue, snipers on rooftops, drones. This isn't just a panel. It's turning into something bigger. Ava nodded, silent. You okay? Tamara asked. Ava didn't answer right away. She was remembering the email, the one with the black cross. The one that still hadn't left her mind. I'm ready, she finally said. Scared. But ready. That night, the team held a strategy session in a private hotel suite near Capitol Hill. The atmosphere was tense. Dr. Pierce arrived late, his usual composure tinged with fatigue. They're trying to get the broadcast pulled, he announced, setting down his briefcase. 3 major networks have received petitions. Sponsors are getting cold feet. Of course they are, Ava replied, arms crossed. This isn't a debate to them, it's a disruption. Exactly, Pierce said. And that's why we can't back down. If they silence this, it sends a message, some truths are too dangerous to be spoken. Tamara leaned forward. Do we have backup? Legal? Press? Yes, Pierce confirmed. The show is still on. But Ava, once that camera rolls, you're walking into the center of the fire. There won't be room for hesitation. I've been in the fire for months, Ava said, her voice cold steel. This is just the biggest blaze. The next morning, Ava woke to chaos. A church near the venue, a historic black church that had agreed to host a pre-event community gathering, was firebombed overnight. No casualties. But the message was clear. Tamara burst into Ava's hotel room just after 6 a.m., they left flyers. Burned Bibles. A note that said, "Stay out of God's house." Ava felt the heat rush to her face, not from fear, but fury. They want us to believe we don't belong in the conversation, she said, pacing. That black people don't belong in the Bible. In the church. In the truth. Tamara nodded. So what do we do? Ava stopped walking. Looked Tamara in the eyes. We show up louder. Stronger. And we remind them, God never asked anyone's permission before he used people for his purpose. Later that day, at a private press conference, Ava stood beside faith leaders of all backgrounds, black, white, Hispanic, Jewish, Muslim, men and women who had chosen to speak in solidarity. One of them, an older pastor named Reverend Wallace, took the podium before her. For too long, he said, the Bible has been whitewashed. Sanitized. Stripped of its origin. But history doesn't need our permission to be true. It just needs a voice. Then he turned to Ava. And today, that voice belongs to her. When Ava stepped up to speak, the room went quiet. Cameras flashed. Journalists leaned in. Protesters shouted from outside. She took a breath and said, "We are not rewriting the Bible. We are rereading it. Through lenses that have always been there, waiting to be picked up." She paused. And if that truth burns a few buildings, maybe it's because the foundation was never as solid as they told us. The silence afterward was thunderous. That night, alone in her suite, Ava sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the Bible she'd carried since college. Its pages were worn, underlined, dog-eared. She opened to the book of Acts, tracing her finger across the words describing the Ethiopian eunuch, the first non-Jewish convert to Christianity. A black man. A keeper of scripture. A bridge between worlds. She whispered to herself, "We were always there." Then her phone buzzed again. Another anonymous message. This one read simply, "You'll regret tomorrow. God will silence you." She stared at it, then deleted it without hesitation. God didn't silence Moses, she said aloud. He sent him. The stage was set. Under the vaulted glass ceiling of the Walter E. Washington Convention Center, a sea of cameras, cables, and crew bustled like clockwork. Every wire had been tested. Every mic double-checked. The network had cleared all protocols. The town hall was live across the country in less than an hour. Backstage, Ava stood in front of a mirror, barely recognizing the woman staring back. She had once been a scholar writing papers nobody read. Now, she was at the center of a cultural earthquake that reached from black churches in Georgia to political roundtables on Capitol Hill. She could hear the murmurs of the crowd filtering in through the curtains. Protesters were being kept a block away, but their chants could still be heard faintly over the roar of DC traffic. Keep politics out of the pulpit. Biblical lies divide. Ava King is not the truth. Tamara slipped into the dressing room, clipboard in hand, face calm but eyes burning. Final call. You ready? Ava exhaled. Does it matter? It matters to you, Tamara replied. And that's what got us this far. The lights dimmed. The host, an award-winning journalist named Marcus Reed, took the stage. Good evening, America, he began. Tonight, we gather to confront questions long buried and voices long ignored. The Bible has been at the center of Western civilization for millennia, but whose stories have we chosen to see, and whose have we erased? The crowd, diverse, curious, tense, leaned in. Please welcome our first guest, Ava King. Ava stepped onto the stage. Applause met her, but so did stares, skeptical, supportive, and everything in between. She sat opposite Marcus, the cameras closing in. You've made some bold claims, Marcus began. That black people not only appear in the Bible, but play central, often ignored roles. And you say these omissions are not accidental, but systematic. Do you stand by that? Ava nodded. Absolutely. Explain. Ava leaned forward. Take Nimrod. Genesis describes him as a mighty man from the land of Cush, ancient Ethiopia. The Queen of Sheba. She came from a black kingdom. Even Moses passed for an Egyptian, a people depicted with dark skin. The Bible didn't erase black people, our interpretations did. The room was silent. Even the live audience at home could feel the weight. But these aren't just facts, Ava continued. They're roots. If you strip a people from their spiritual heritage, you don't just rewrite history, you remove their power. Marcus didn't flinch. Some say you're race-baiting. That you're injecting identity politics into sacred texts. I'm restoring identity, Ava countered. Not inserting it. There's a difference. From the side stage, Dr. Pierce was called next. He took his seat beside Ava, a visible symbol of how far the two had come. I've disagreed with Ms. King publicly, he began, but the deeper I investigated her claims, the more I realized how much we've accepted assumptions as fact. Scripture deserves scrutiny. And truth deserves space. The audience buzzed, some nodding, others clearly agitated. Then came the panel, a pastor from Mississippi, a black seminary professor, a conservative Christian author, and a young black woman raised in the AME church. What followed was less a debate than a storm, interrupted constantly by applause, tension, gasps. The conservative author challenged Ava, "You're dismantling thousands of years of tradition." Ava replied, "No. I'm revealing what tradition conveniently ignored." The professor added, "White Jesus is not just inaccurate. It's political." The crowd erupted. Then the young woman said something that silenced everyone. "I grew up thinking my skin had nothing to do with God's plan. Then I heard Ava speak. Now I know, I've always been part of the story." A hush fell over the auditorium. During a commercial break, Ava stepped backstage for a moment. Her hands were shaking. Tamara approached, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're doing it. This is history." "I feel like I'm standing on a cliff," Ava whispered. "You are," Tamara said. "But look how many people followed you here." As the final segment approached, Marcus turned to Ava and asked the one question she hadn't prepared for. "What do you want from this moment, Ava? What's the endgame?" Ava paused. And then she answered, not to Marcus, not to the cameras, but to the millions watching. "I want every black child sitting in a pew to know they were never visitors in God's story. They were there in the beginning. As kings. As prophets. As vessels. I want the world to understand that this isn't about rewriting faith, it's about reclaiming it. The truth is not divisive. Silence is." The crowd stood. Applause shook the walls. After the show, Ava walked alone into the cool DC night. Sirens echoed faintly. Protesters had thinned. The air was still electric. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. "You made it through tonight. Don't get comfortable." She stared at the message. Then typed back, "You watched every second, didn't you?" No reply. She put the phone in her pocket, looked up at the Washington Monument shining above the city, and whispered. "Let them come." It was the morning after the town hall. The streets of D.C. were still littered with protest signs, some supportive, others angry and venomous. Headlines were already flooding every news outlet. Ava King's town hall divides the nation. Historic or heresy? Biblical blackness sparks nationwide debate. Ava sat in the back seat of a black SUV, her face pale with exhaustion. The kind of tired that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from carrying the weight of something that feels too heavy to name. Tamara sat beside her, scrolling through live updates. "Over 12 million watched the town hall," she said. "You trended all night. Hashtags in 5 countries. Even some European scholars are jumping into the conversation." Ava didn't react. She was looking out the window, eyes unfocused. You good? Tamara asked quietly. Ava finally turned toward her. No. But I didn't come here to feel good. The threats intensified overnight. More anonymous texts. Emails. A physical letter slid under her hotel room door that read, in bold block letters. Jezebel lives. God will not be mocked. The hotel increased security. Her private security team switched shifts to 24-hour rotations. Even Dr. Pierce received a message at his university office that simply read, "You've sided with the serpent." I didn't think this would follow me, he confessed over the phone. But it's not just about you anymore, Ava. You've shaken something bigger than either of us. Back in her hotel suite, Ava was finally alone. She peeled off her coat, her body sore, her mind racing. She sat on the edge of her bed and opened her laptop. Her inbox was flooded, hundreds of messages per hour. Some were vicious. Others were love letters from strangers. One email stopped her. From Pastor Reuben Whitaker. Subject, thank you. Ava. I'm a 67-year-old pastor from rural Alabama. I've spent most of my life preaching a gospel I thought was pure, white robes, white angels, white prophets. I watched your town hall last night, and for the first time in decades, I wept. You didn't destroy my faith, you revived it. I'm preaching about the Ethiopian eunuch this Sunday. And I'll say your name. Thank you. R.W. Ava pressed her hand to her chest. She didn't cry. She couldn't. Not yet. That night, she got a call from Elijah. I watched it twice, he said. Once as your friend. Once as a black man raised in a world that tried to make me invisible. You crushed it, Ava. But it comes with a cost, she said, finishing the sentence. Exactly. And I'm worried you're gonna carry that cost alone. There was silence on the line before Elijah added, come home for a bit. Just to breathe. Get grounded. Home. It had been almost a year since she left Georgia. The thought of going back, of walking through her old neighborhood, seeing her mother's garden, hearing the church bells she grew up with, it sounded almost unbearable. But it also sounded like healing. The next morning, Ava boarded a flight south. She didn't tell anyone but Tamara. No media, no social posts. She just disappeared, for a while. When she landed in Atlanta and stepped outside, the humid air wrapped around her like a familiar song. Her mom met her at the curb in an old Buick that smelled like lavender and worn leather. I watched it 3 times, her mother said as they drove. Once for you. Twice for all the women who never got the chance to speak. Ava smiled softly. It nearly broke me. Her mom reached over and touched her hand. Then let it. The truth should break something before it sets anything free. Back in her childhood bedroom, Ava stared at the bookshelf that once held her Sunday school awards. They were still there, tucked beside a worn King James Bible and a faded copy of Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. She picked up the Bible, thumbing through its marked pages. She had memorized verses here. Prayed for clarity here. Cried after her father's funeral here. And now she was rewriting everything she thought she knew. The next morning, she walked to the little church down the road, the same one she had stopped attending after college. A new pastor had taken over. Young, black, female. Ava sat quietly in the back. When the pastor spoke of Moses, of how he was adopted, conflicted, burdened with truth, Ava felt seen in a way she hadn't in months. After the service, the pastor approached her. I know who you are, she said, smiling. And I just want to say, you're not crazy. You're called. That night, back on the porch swing with her mother, Ava stared up at the stars. You're not done, are you? Her mom asked. Ava shook her head slowly. No. I think this is just the halfway point. Then rest while you can. Storms don't wait forever. Ava nodded. Because she knew what was coming next wasn't just about scholarship. It was about survival. And the truth, real, raw, unshakable, was worth every scar. The peace Ava found in Georgia didn't last long. 3 days after returning to D.C., the backlash erupted into full-blown war. It started with a headline, one that felt like it was designed to crush everything she had built. Controversial scholar Ava King accused of fabricating historical evidence. It was everywhere. Cable news. Talk radio. Podcasts. Even religious blogs that had once cautiously supported her turned cold overnight. The source. An op-ed published in a conservative Christian think tank's journal, authored by a high-profile biblical archaeologist named Dr. Franklin Rudd, a man with deep ties to political donors and evangelical leaders. The article was brutal. It accused Ava of cherry-picking sources, misrepresenting cultural origins, and, most damningly, manipulating data to fuel a racially divisive narrative. Within hours, churches that had hosted her began issuing statements of regret. Bookstores pulled her titles. Scheduled lectures were postponed indefinitely. One network dropped their planned documentary featuring her. She'd been in a cultural firestorm before, but this time, they were trying to burn her name off the map entirely. Tamara called her almost immediately. They coordinated this, she said, furious. I've already tracked the publishing timeline. Rudd's article was embargoed for a week, this was planned. There's funding behind it. Serious money. Ava stood in the middle of her apartment, staring at the television where her own face flickered behind a breaking news ticker. This isn't about facts anymore, she said quietly. It's about erasure. Tamara was silent. We need to respond, Ava added. Not react. Respond. Intelligently. Relentlessly. They assembled the team that same evening. Dr. Pierce was livid. This is the oldest play in the book. Discredit the person so you can discredit the message. They're not arguing your points, they're assassinating your integrity. We'll issue a full academic response, said one of Ava's research partners. Line by line. Every reference, every citation. We'll defend it all. No, Ava interrupted. We won't just defend. We'll expose. The room turned toward her. I want to know who's funding Rudd. I want to know who benefits from this backlash. I want to know which institutions are threatened by what we've uncovered, and why. Her voice had steel in it now. She wasn't just surviving the counterattack. She was preparing to counterpunch. While the academic team got to work drafting the formal rebuttal, Tamara dug deeper. What she found stunned even Ava. Rudd had received undisclosed grants from a foundation tied to a megachurch network known for its nationalist theology. The same network that had publicly condemned Ava's work months before. Financial records showed recent lobbying efforts to influence Christian school curricula, specifically, to remove discussions of ethnicity in biblical teaching. This isn't just theological, Tamara said. It's political. They're trying to lock down a version of the Bible that supports their worldview. Ava leaned back in her chair. Then we need to open the floodgates. The next week, Ava went on the offensive. She published an open letter in The Atlantic, co-signed by more than 100 theologians, historians, and clergy from across denominations. It laid out the facts clearly. Named the patterns. Pointed to centuries of racialized theological framing, and directly challenged Dr. Rudd to a public debate. Then she followed it up with something bolder. A video essay. 5 minutes. Raw. Personal. No makeup. No production. Just Ava, staring into the camera, saying. You can attack me. But you cannot erase the truth. The Bible didn't begin in Europe. It began in deserts and rivers and kingdoms that looked a lot like mine. And if that offends you, it's not because it's false. It's because it's finally being said. The video went viral. Again. 20 million views in 4 days. Shared by pastors, celebrities, scholars. Even Ava's harshest critics were forced to respond, and many did, with deflection and spin. But the tone had shifted. The people watching. They weren't backing away. They were leaning in. Still, the threats intensified. Ava's mother received a fake eviction notice, clearly meant to scare. Ava's university email was hacked and flooded with hate mail. Someone spray-painted the word heretic on the entrance to her building. But Ava didn't stop. She couldn't. She had stepped into a war older than she was. Older than her ancestors. A war not of bullets, but of ideas. And once you speak truth at that scale, you can't whisper again. Late one night, as Ava sat reviewing an annotated manuscript of early church history, her phone buzzed with a new number. She almost didn't answer. But something told her to. Hello. There was a pause. Then a quiet, raspy voice. This is Bishop Andreas from Cairo. I saw your work. You're not wrong. The Nubian Christians were erased from history for a reason. I have manuscripts you should see. Ones no one in the West has. Ava sat straight up. Can you send them? No, the bishop replied. You must come. She hung up the phone in silence, the weight of it all pressing down on her chest. They had tried to destroy her. Instead, they opened a door. A new chapter. A deeper truth. And the journey wasn't over. Not even close. Ava had been to the Middle East before, but never like this. She stepped off the plane into the dry Cairo heat, cloaked in a scarf and sunglasses to avoid attention. The press frenzy back home had only intensified after her open letter and viral video. International media had started calling her the prophet of disruption. Some praised her. Others accused her of heresy on a global scale. But none of that mattered now. She was here for something older than opinion. Something sacred. Bishop Andreas met her just outside customs, wearing a faded robe and a wooden cross around his neck. His eyes were gentle but alert. You came, he said in thickly accented English. I had to, Ava replied. He led her through winding streets of old Cairo to a humble Coptic monastery nestled between ancient walls. Inside, past rows of candles and icons, through a hidden stairwell and beneath a locked iron gate, was a small stone chamber. Ava stepped inside. It was dim, cool, and smelled of parchment and dust. Bishop Andreas handed her gloves. What I'm about to show you, he said, has not seen daylight in almost 600 years. The manuscripts were wrapped in goatskin and bound with ancient thread. Written in Guizi, Coptic, and early Arabic, they were painstakingly preserved, and shockingly intact. Ava's hands trembled as she opened the first one. She recognized the format immediately, canonical scripture. But this was different. There were names, places, and passages she had never seen in any Western version of the Bible. One section detailed the royal court of the Queen of Sheba, not as a footnote, but as a central setting. Another described early Christian communities in Nubia and Aksum, complete with genealogy and liturgy. And then there was the most shocking page of all. An illustrated family tree, tracing back from King David, through Solomon and Sheba's union, into a line of Ethiopian kings that had carried the torch of Yahweh long before Europe even knew his name. Ava sat back, stunned. This rewrites everything, she whispered. Bishop Andreas nodded solemnly. It doesn't rewrite, he corrected. It restores. For the next 4 days, Ava worked alongside a small team of local scholars to digitize and translate key portions. Every hour brought a new revelation. Prayers written in the voice of black prophets. Christ described with skin like bronze, eyes like fire. A clear, recurring affirmation that the divine story of redemption began in Africa, and would return there again. There was no denying it, these manuscripts didn't just support Ava's claims. They exceeded them. But the fifth night brought danger. While returning to her guest house, Ava's driver was ambushed. Two masked men attempted to seize her briefcase, believing it held physical copies of the manuscripts. The driver fought them off. Ava escaped unharmed, but shaken. She knew then, someone was watching. And someone didn't want these texts to see the light. She called Tamara immediately. "I need security when I land. Real security. And we need to get this to a secure lab for authentication. The backlash is about to turn into a holy war." Tamara's voice was urgent. "Already ahead of you. I've got Stanford, Oxford, and the Smithsonian all on standby. And, Ava. Your video from Cairo hit 10 million views already. The church world is losing its mind." Ava looked out the window at the moon hanging over Cairo's rooftops. "Good," she said. "Let them." The flight back to the US was sleepless. Ava sat with a secure hard drive in her carry-on, handcuffed to her wrist. The files inside it were encrypted and triple backed up in case anything happened to her. By the time she landed in DC, a full media storm was waiting. She didn't stop to answer questions. Didn't wave. She had truth in her hand now, and history behind her. The press conference was called 2 days later. Ava stood before a room full of scholars, journalists, and church leaders. She looked thinner, sharper, like iron forged in fire. Behind her, a screen displayed the digitized manuscript pages. Her voice was calm but forceful as she explained. These texts were not hidden because they were false. They were hidden because they were inconvenient. Because they center Africa in a story Western power wanted to claim as its own. This isn't conspiracy. It's canon. Forgotten, yes. Suppressed, maybe. But now, restored. When she finished, the room was quiet. Then came the wave of questions. Some hostile. Some awestruck. What does this mean for Christianity as we know it? Ava didn't flinch. It means we must begin again. Later that night, back in her apartment, Ava poured herself a glass of water and sat in silence. Her phone lit up with a message from Elijah. "This changes everything. Proud of you. But be careful. You've just become the most dangerous person in the church." She smiled faintly. She wasn't interested in being dangerous. She was interested in being true. And now, the truth had manuscripts to stand on. The moment had come, not just for Ava King, but for a world wrestling with the truth it had buried for centuries. Ava stood backstage at the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. The air buzzed with anticipation. Tonight wasn't a debate. It wasn't a lecture. It was a reckoning. A global live stream had been set up for what was being called the Gospel Revisited, an unprecedented public presentation of the lost African manuscripts authenticated by international scholars, theologians, and linguists. Every major media outlet was tuned in. The Vatican had sent a representative. Even the Israeli Antiquities Authority and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church had released statements acknowledging the historical significance of the documents Ava had uncovered. The world was watching. And many were afraid. Behind the scenes, Tamara checked the tech crew one final time. She turned to Ava. "You ready to break the last dam?" Ava gave a slow, steady nod. Her voice was calm. "Tonight isn't about breaking anything. It's about remembering what was stolen." The auditorium lights dimmed. Marcus Reed returned as the evening's host, dressed in all black, his tone somber but steady. "Tonight," he said, "we stand at the intersection of faith, history, and truth. What you're about to see has the power to unsettle centuries of assumption. But more importantly, it may set millions free. He introduced Ava, calling her not just a scholar, but a witness. The audience rose in a standing ovation as she walked to the podium. But Ava didn't smile. She looked out over the crowd, black, brown, white, curious, hostile, reverent, and asked the question that started it all. What if everything you were taught about the people in the Bible was incomplete by design? Silence. She continued. These manuscripts reveal a story bigger than empire. Bigger than tradition. A story that begins not in Europe, but in the kingdoms of Kush and Sheba. In the banks of the Nile and the mountains of Aksum. A story where blackness isn't an afterthought, it's the beginning. We didn't just appear in chains. We appeared in crowns. She clicked the remote, and the screen behind her displayed a high-resolution scan of the Sheba David lineage document, the ancient family tree connecting Solomon to the royal houses of Ethiopia. A ripple ran through the room. Then came pages showing early African liturgies, hymns written in Guizi, praising a savior with hair like wool, skin of bronze. You've seen these descriptions before, Ava said. But never through the lens of legitimacy. Never as the default. Only as metaphor. Or myth. Tonight, we return the narrative to its rightful owners. Her voice grew stronger. This isn't just historical. It's theological. If your gospel erases Africa, it erases the fullness of God. The first hour was met with applause, gasps, and tears. But the second hour brought the resistance. Mid-presentation, a group of protesters stormed the side doors. Shouting. Holding signs. One read, "The Black Bible is a lie." Another, "Heresy has a name." Security moved in fast. Some in the crowd shouted back. For a moment, it felt like the whole event would collapse. Ava stepped away from the podium and walked toward the edge of the stage. She held up her hand, not to silence the crowd, but to speak directly to the chaos. You don't have to be afraid of the truth. It doesn't erase you. It completes the story. This isn't about taking away anyone's God. It's about showing that he never belonged to just one people to begin with. The protesters were escorted out. But the room stayed with her. And when she returned to the podium, something had shifted. This wasn't just a presentation anymore. It was a movement. Later that night, after the broadcast ended and the world had begun to process what it had witnessed, Ava stood alone in the museum's reflection room. Around her were artifacts of African American history, slave shackles, civil rights posters, faded photographs of nameless faces who had fought battles no one had ever documented. Ava ran her hand along a glass case holding a rusted Bible found in the ruins of a plantation. She whispered, "You were always in it. They just never told us." Tamara appeared quietly beside her. "They're saying the church has to respond," she said. "Pope's envoy is requesting a meeting. Harvard wants a series. Oprah's calling." Ava smiled softly. "They'll come around. Eventually." Tamara looked at her closely. "So what now?" Ava exhaled slowly, then turned toward the exit. "Now, we build a church where our names were never erased." Ava stood before a modest congregation in a small but growing church just outside Atlanta. The banner above the pulpit read, "First Church of the True Origin." Her voice echoed with clarity. The God of Abraham was the God of Africa before he ever reached Rome. The story doesn't start with the cross. It starts with a people who walked with God before anyone tried to hide them. And today, we reclaim what was always ours. The greatest trick was convincing us we were outsiders to the story. The greatest truth is knowing, we've always been at the center. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?